I'm Kelly Mitchell. It's really nice to be here. The second time I think I've appeared before the Kansas Sentencing Commission, and I remember having dinner with a couple of you in Alexandria at the last NASC committee meeting, so it's really nice to see you all again. So we're going to talk about three things in the time that we have this morning. The first thing we're going to talk about is the framework for reforming probation and parole that Pew has published. The Robina Institute supported the development of that framework by doing some of the research to figure out where the evidence base was for some of the policies that are in there. And then after that, Aaron and I are going to take over. So Connie's going to start by going over the framework. And then Aaron and I are going to take over, and we're going to talk about some current projects that we're working on at Robina to try to tackle probation revocations at the local level. So we're going to go from sort of high level down to local level and hopefully give you a lot of ideas along the way. If you have questions along the way, please feel free to ask them. But that's basically the morning. So I'm going to turn it over to Connie and we'll start there.
Great, thanks so much, Kelly, and good morning. I'm going to share my PowerPoint presentation with you. I've never done this on an iPad before, so hopefully that'll work. Bear with me 1 second. Actually, I don't know. Am I able to share, Commissioner Schultz? Am I able to share content?
Yes, you should be able to share.
Actually, Kelly, can you pitch it for me? Thank you. I had sent the presentation to her just to make sure that I wouldn't have any technical issues. So good morning, everybody, and thank you again for letting me share a little bit about the policy framework. I would like to just kind of give you guys a little bit of background about it and then kind of get into the actual policies. And as Kelly mentioned, we would love to have any conversation. I know that you've already talked a lot about various policy initiatives, and I think that some of those will be highlighted throughout this presentation, so we can definitely get into more of the content if anyone is curious. Next slide, Kelly. So just to start, we began developing this document 2 years ago to highlight community supervision as a way to provide jurisdictions and additional resources to push reforms that help probation and parole function more effectively. Pew did this along with a partnership with Arnold Ventures and put together an advisory council to support this work. Next slide, Kelly. So the council, as you can see here, featured a diverse group of representatives from probation and parole agencies, law enforcement, the judiciary, affected communities, the behavioral health field, advocates, and academia. And we also contracted with the Robina Institute to provide the research foundation for the policies discussed. And if you look through this list, you might see your fellow Kansan here, Chairman Ogletree. He came to two of our the two advisory council meetings that we had in person, and then also provided insight and edits to the document as it kind of went through its various processes. So the advisory council worked together to identify policy options for state lawmakers and practitioners to enhance their system. And the focus of the policies had the following goals in mind. One, to provide better outcomes for people on supervision, their families and communities. Two, to create a smaller system targeting supervision on those that need it. And then three, to have fewer revocations for violations, and particularly those resulting in incarceration. So the policies are organized into 7 buckets. So Kelly, next slide. And as you can see here, these are the 7 buckets: enacting alternatives to arrest, incarceration, and supervision, implementing evidence-based policies centered around risk and needs, adopting shorter supervision terms based on incentives and goals that change behavior, establishing effective and appropriate supervision conditions, developing individualized conditions regarding the payment of legal financial obligations, reducing incarceration and promoting long-term success, and then finally providing community supervision agencies with the support they need to be effective. And so I'll kind of go through each of these different buckets, and then hopefully we'll stop on some of the areas that I think that you all may be more interested in. And then Kelly and Aaron are, I'm gonna, hopefully they'll jump in and kind of provide some of the research support and can help buttress these policies with that insight. And then please, again, if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to make, please feel free to interrupt me. So next slide, Kelly. So this first section, enacting alternatives to arrest, incarceration, and supervision, is really having to do with admissions. So because supervision, as you probably all know, by its nature is a really back-end part of the system, there is little control about who enters supervision. And these policies attempt to kind of curb that entry point, such as through deferred prosecution and changing to sentencing laws. So we know that research has consistently shown that supervision is not effective for individuals with a low risk of reoffending and can even increase that risk. So a lot of these policies are attempting to target those who are low risk at that kind of beginning stage. And I can kind of go over a few of them if those are interested. I saw kind of the previous policy agenda. I know that revising felony theft thresholds for property offenses is one of the pieces that was on your legislative agenda. If folks are curious, there's content in the policy framework about this. We know that since 2001, at least 35 states have raised their thresholds. And 6 states have had felony thresholds at $1,500. Among them were Texas, Georgia, and Utah. Actually, Texas recently increased their threshold to $2,500. And a number of states have actually moved to reform their drug offenses, oftentimes reducing some of the possession offenses from a felony to a misdemeanor. Aaron, Kelly, anything you guys like to add? Okay, hearing none, I'll keep moving. So the second bucket, if you could advance to slide 1, Kelly, is really based on the foundation of effective supervision. And this is, evidence-based decision-making. And I'm sure your systems already have many, if not all of these policies as part of your system. Assessing risk and needs, using a validated tool, basing case plans on risk and needs. Sometimes many different jurisdictions will supervise by risk level. Sometimes jurisdictions are able to implement specialized caseloads, or they can do kind of a workload analysis to set a caseload size. So that's kind of what the content of this bucket is. Okay, next slide, Kelly. I think you need to go back 1, I think run 3, yeah. Great, thank you. So while the first bucket of policies really is looking at aiming addressing admissions, this bucket looks at the time individuals are on supervision. So research has demonstrated that long supervision terms deliver diminishing public safety benefits. And I'm just going to go through a couple of these policies and highlight those. And I'd love to hear, again, from any of you if there are policies that you're most interested in. So, for example, providing goal-based supervision. This really begins with officers and individuals working together to identify customized objectives, such as full-time employment, and this is part of their case plan. So instead of an actual specific time frame in which somebody is on supervision, if the individual on supervision can complete certain objectives, then they can get off of supervision quicker, or in some cases, it could potentially take longer, but I think the idea is really that through completing various objectives, they are motivated to move off of supervision and kind of complete parts of their case plan. That's one of the policies that's discussed here. Another one is earned compliance credits. A number of states have adopted this kind of policy. So far, I think the count is up to 19. The Pew Charitable Trust, we did a policy evaluation of one of the states that adopted this policy. Missouri adopted it in 2012. And over the first 3 years that the policy was enacted, they were able to shrink their supervision population by 18%, which was roughly 13,000 people. The average caseload sizes decreased by 16%, and there was no increase in recidivism. So the policy framework will also kind of walk through some of the things to think about if a state wants to adopt such a policy, such as what kind of compliance credits or how many a jurisdiction would like to give. Some jurisdictions do, 20 for 30, some do 30 for 30, 30 credits for 30 days on supervision. I think one of the big factors in administering earned compliance credits really has to do with whether or not one of the conditions for compliance is whether or not if somebody's up to date with their fines and fees. We know that generally, and especially now, people probably are really struggling in order to pay these fines and fees. And so a lot of times individuals on supervision can be compliant with their case plan, but may not be up to date with their fees. And so the question is what, oh, sorry, does somebody want to share? Okay, feel free to jump in. So yes.
This is Scott. I do have a kind of an observation or a question. Part of I know that Kelly has talked to me before about, many other jurisdictions throughout the country have long probation terms. I think probably Kansas probably has relatively short ones in comparison. We go anywhere from 12 months to 36 months versus years and years of folks being on that. As far as, we've kind of been looking into that second bullet point, the incentives to influence behavior. We give a lot of compliance credits on the backside in terms of the incarcerated population. Another thing we're trying to explore is trying to give those compliance credits for probation folks. And how do you be able to have probationers responded accordingly in the other states, and how do you actually sell that from a perspective of, well, they're getting 24 months of probation, that's what they're supposed to be doing. Why should we be giving them credit for doing what they're supposed to be doing as far as their terms and conditions?
That's a great question, Commissioner. So I think a lot of the messaging, oh, sorry, does someone want to say something? Okay, so I think a lot of the messaging that goes into it is that the focus of supervision is really for someone to comply with their case plan and to abilities of that case plan. So I think that oftentimes, like somebody on supervision may not necessarily do those things, and so the incentive to do that is really kind of one of the motivating factors. And so earn compliance credits, a way to shorten that time that you're on supervision, is what we found through research to be one of the more motivating components of that. And so it hasn't been it hasn't necessarily been like a huge lift in other jurisdictions that I've worked in to try to encourage or to have them pass an earned compliance credit policy, because the goal that they have is not necessarily that this person is on supervision for 2 years or 4 years or whatever that term, but it's really for them to actually change their behavior and to not recidivate. But the incentive question is a good one. Aaron or Kelly, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the research that kind of goes into what is an incentive to influence behavior?
Yeah, I wanted to add a couple things. Sorry, I left you out there on the earlier slide. I literally couldn't find my unmute with the PowerPoint running, but I wanted to add in here. So one of the keys is it's really important if you use an earned discharge program to actually tell the probationer or the person on supervision, whether it's probation or parole, like what that plan is up front. Because if they are not aware of the program, if they're not aware of the fact that they can earn their way, to less time, then it's actually not, it doesn't help them at all. There has been research done though to a number of people on supervision were surveyed to see what sorts of things were most incentivizing for them. And it turned out that earning the time off was the thing that rose to the top. They looked at all kinds of things that we often use in drug court, for instance, like, ticket or movie tickets or bus passes or, like tangible things. And really just the earned time was the thing that people responded to the most. And the research has also looked at, is the incentive is most useful when it's something that's meaningful to the individual. So trying to find that sweet spot of what motivates people is the key here. So kind of, so from the research, it's time off, and from the implementation level, it's telling them about it up front, which it seems like a no-brainer, but honestly doesn't happen everywhere. So that's two things. And I had a third point, which I lost, but, and the third point was in terms of the length of probation. When we did this research, I'm from Minnesota, the land of the 40-year probation term. So for me, it was really important to think of ways to bring those numbers down. But most places that have implemented earned discharge actually have much shorter terms, and sort of a cap at 5 years was more common. And so I think that the long probation terms is not really an issue. It's more about just sort of trying to find that incentive that's meaningful to the person that's going to actually influence behavioral change. And did we lose Connie? Are you still there?
No, I'm still here. I'm sorry. Something was happening with my computer, but I'm here.
Okay, good.
Yeah. I have a question, and it has to do with the fines and fees. Very taken with your research, and fully believe that those fines and fees, are a huge impediment to having good earned time credit. How we organize money in Kansas for community corrections is we give block grants to the different judicial districts, the 31 judicial districts, and then they decide what to do, with the money. I mean, it's for community corrections. What have you seen that scheme before, and how can we incentivize that money will help reduce particularly fees for different services? Because it's the fees for those that I think are an impediment.
So I don't know how to influence how the money is spent, but I do think you're making a good policy choice in not tying the fines and fees directly to the budget of the individual agency. We've done research in one jurisdiction that will remain nameless, where the fines and fees went directly to the probation department's budget, and in the probation officers' annual increases in salary were actually tied to their collection rates. So creating this perverse incentive, we also found in that jurisdiction that the people who paid, even though they had an early discharge policy, were the people who were never let off because they were paying the bills of the probation agency. It created this completely backwards, perverse incentive. So disconnecting it in that way, where you have more of that, the money maybe is going into your general fund and then you're allocating it, that like sort of eliminates that disincentive, right? So I think that's a good step. In terms of, and then I don't know, Connie, maybe you have some ideas for how to influence how the money is spent on the ground. I don't have anything magic there to offer.
Yeah, nothing magic from me either. We do talk a little bit more about fines and fees specifically and how they're, how they're assessed. But I think that the question, and maybe this is something that you've probably already thought about, was some kind of like a performance incentive funding component to it, that if there are particular initiatives that you find that you would like to encourage, such as probation agents or parole agents working with their individual and not necessarily revoking for certain kinds of violations, and seeing kind of like just that number start to reduce, and then providing funding for those types of agencies or for additional programming in those communities. That's another way that I've seen kind of how funding gets allocated based on particular initiatives that a jurisdiction finds important.
Thank you.
One thing I would want to add, though, it is this point that Connie made about really thinking about whether payment of fines and fees affects the ability to earn credits. That's a really important one, because the other thing we have to remember is that there is constitutional case law from the Supreme Court saying that you cannot incarcerate a person for inability to pay. And so if we sort of, you know, think that through to the natural endpoint, you are, you know, causing the person to have a longer probation term if you're not providing those compliance credits for inability, if they're unable to pay. So there's a difference between the person who just like doesn't want to pay, willfully doesn't pay, and that's the, you know, sanctions are appropriate and constitutionally valid for that population. But for the people who literally don't have the means to pay those fines and fees, we need to be thinking about how to work with that group differently and how to incentivize them so they can get off paper, they can get into, you know, to be working members of society, so that they can address those debts down the road.
Kelly, should we go to the next slide?
Sounds good.
Great.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, I have to, okay.
Great, thanks so much. This bucket discusses standard conditions that are tailored and focused on an individual's risk and needs. And so, for example, one of the policies here, you'll see requiring drug testing only to determine treatment needs. The Advisory Council kind of receives research from the Robina Institute, and Kelly and Eric can probably speak more to this, that found that if the goal is really to stop people from using substances, drug testing alone will not lead to kind of behavior change. So services and treatment are really necessary to address substance abuse issues. And then studies have found that, you know, failed drug testing, not surprisingly, contributed substantially to the high rate of technical violations or technical revocation. So some jurisdictions have tried to get some kind of testing, or one, to kind of limit drug testing only to those people who actually have substance use issues. And then the second thing, because oftentimes we know that drug testing is kind of a standard condition that's placed on everybody, regardless if they have a substance abuse issue or not. So one of them is to limit that, which also tends to limit expenses. And then the other component is when somebody tests positive, is the response going to be a violation that then potentially could lead them to being revoked, or is the response then a treatment response? So that's kind of one of the questions to be thinking about. Another component of this is based in conditions on supervision goals. A number of states have looked to reduce the amount of conditions. We were working in Arizona this past year, and some of the feedback that we got from probation agents was that the list alone was overwhelming to individuals, let alone the actual content of what the conditions were. So just seeing that there were 17 conditions that they had to follow, plus the potential another 6 that judges could kind of check off depending on the circumstances of the individual, just overwhelmed them just from the jump. And so how to fully focus conditions on what is most meaningful. You know, following the case plan, not impacting public safety. So I know Minnesota did some work on reducing conditions. Georgia has also reduced parole conditions. So what they found the most kind of necessary to focus on. So that's another content that's in this section. Okay, we'll keep it moving then. So this section, as you can see, there are a number of policies here, developing individualized conditions for payment of legal financial obligations. They really range from a number of different policies that different jurisdictions have adopted about how to address kind of this issue of fines and fees. Some jurisdictions have looked to kind of put a moratorium on fines and fees when people are re-entering the community from prison for the first 6 months of parole, as a way to kind of help people acclimate and kind of stabilize before they have to pay these fines and fees. Oftentimes, I think jurisdictions have an ability to pay, and then how that gets doled out, I think, is a question. Louisiana recently passed a day fine. I can't think it's called a day fine policy, in which they have to, an individual on supervision has to pay equivalent for that month, equivalent to what is like worth 1 day of pay. So this section kind of just gives a lot of various policy options to think about in order to I guess, support people being able to pay their fines and fees, and also in incentivizing that effort to do so. One of the policies, and this kind of was taken off of the school loans, if people have school loans or are helping their kids pay off their student loans, there's policy that if you pay a certain number of payments, then the rest can be forgiven after a certain amount of time. So one of the options here is if an individual is able to make their payment plans based on their ability to pay for a year or 18 months, can they suspend the rest of remove the rest of those payments? So here are some of those options. Okay, we'll jump to the next one, Kelly. So this is a broad section to reduce pathways to incarceration. It really consists of policies surrounding revocation, and then also ways to support the transition from kind of an incarceral setting, so jail or prison, to the community, such as the use of transition specialists or maintaining some kind of substance abuse treatment from prison to the community. So here, this is a lot of the ones about how do you define a technical violation? Is that known to the personnel and supervision? Developing supervision responses to absconding, I think, is a big issue that a lot of agencies and jurisdictions have to contend with, this issue of absconding. The question is whether or not, a phone call or a missed meeting leads to an absconsion, or does it require some kind of proactive effort from the agent to really try to find this individual before you issue a warrant? There's various policies here about kind of revocation caps, limiting the time that people spend incarcerated for technical violations, also limiting the time that people spend in jail awaiting a hearing. Can we issue a summons? Does it have to be a warrant for that initial one? And then kind of the latter four policies really discuss kind of that transition point when somebody goes from prison or jail to back to the community. I'm sure Kansas has similar policies about how to support that transition and maintaining some kind of substance abuse treatment. There's discussion here about the use of medically assisted treatment for those people who have substance abuse issues, and even focusing on specialized caseloads for substance abuse or mental health. Kelly or Aaron, is there anything you guys would like to add in this section?
Yeah, I wanted to just provide one additional example of supervision responses for absconding. In one of the jurisdictions that we're working in, there's a sort of a response that I hadn't even realized existed until we started interviewing people. And that was, they have something called a probation review warrant. So they've done all the steps to try to find that person. They've made the phone calls. They've maybe gone out to a couple of places where they might expect the person to be. They've maybe contacted family members. They haven't found this person. So they've created this probation review warrant. And the deal with the bench is that if this person comes in and talks to somebody in the probation department, they'll be released that day. So the goal is really just to reestablish contact. It's not to bring them back to court for violation. So we're still working out, do those people end up being revoked in the end anyway? But I thought it was kind of a different and original way to deal with that issue short of bringing a full violation.
Connie, I have another question.
Go for it.
This is Scott. So one of the things that I'm kind of interested in as far as the points, I think that's 4 and 5, as far as limiting incarceration for technical violations, limiting incarceration pending the revocation hearing. Can either of you speak to those type of situations? As you know, and I'm sure this is available in other jurisdictions too, a lot of the technical violations that result in revocation hearings in Kansas are normally, you don't get to the revocation hearing without having 4 or 5 of them that are in the motion for revocation. Normally a failure to report is not going to result, and Spence and Shelley are community corrections and court services members on the commission. They can, I'm sure, attest to this as well. But what measures as far as, and what do you mean by limiting those incarcerations? Is it they're not serving their original sentences? We've to make this question even longer, we've participated in justice reinvestment. We went ahead and did the graduated sanctions that were recommended, and currently have 2 to 3 day jail stays that probation officers can actually implement. We did have 120 and 180 day prison sanction that was recently repealed based upon the Sentencing Commission's studies that it wasn't making a difference as far as the revocations were concerned. So what is there any other things as far as limiting that incarceration that maybe we haven't thought of that may be worth exploring?
I can start, and then Kelly and Aaron, please feel free to jump in. So definitely not understanding and not knowing the details of the Kansas system, but what a lot of states have done is to just limit the amount of time that someone can be revoked for. I think that what we've heard throughout the country is something similar to what you were saying, that it's typically not one missed meeting that leads to a revocation. It's usually maybe a couple of missed meetings plus a dirty urine, or maybe, and then a number of various technical violations, but not any that particularly are a public safety concern. So the question is, whether or not the probation agent is actually, how are they addressing those smaller violations? How can they support behavior change? We know that just incarcerating somebody doesn't necessarily lead to behavior change. Typically what states have seen, or some of those kind of like quick dips, as they call them, the 2 or 3 days, may for some lead to a wake-up call, but for others it doesn't. So do you really want to incarcerate somebody for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, however long it is, for smaller public safety concern, or for non-public safety issues, just technical violations? I think that the question really comes down to like that, how that probation agent is kind of addressing those issues with that individual. So I think that there are some individuals that can kind of correct their behavior for a night stay in prison or jail, and then there are some of those that may not. But I think that the point in this policy was really about kind of limiting that amount of time, because a longer amount of time in prison or in jail is not going to necessarily lead to the behavior change that you're seeking. So, and we also know that it also derails that individual from whatever positive steps they were taking in the community. So if somebody has like family found housing, or if they have some level of employment, 10 days, 2 weeks incarcerated, they probably will lose that job, potentially lose that housing. And so I think there's like a kind of a weight for that. Kelly, Aaron, do you guys want to add some kind of research component to that?
I think you covered it. I don't know if you have anything, Aaron.
Yeah, just to kind of add on that, I think there's a lot of research now on different use of the short jail stays, like from the HOPE research and similar models. And there's research on incorporating more incentives. We have a lot of different kind of components or sort of sub-policies and evaluations of those. But I think it's a little tricky because, as Connie mentioned, some of those short jail stays can work for some people, but not everyone. And when those, probably the more consistent effects found with the short jail stays is in terms of shaping the kind of short-term behavior, maybe compliance for a short time, but ultimately those will not affect kind of the long-term behavior change that probation is seeking. And so it's kind of figuring out a way to incorporate those maybe as part of the toolbox, or as one of the responses that probation officers might use. But I think also too, it's sort of thinking of how to, this isn't maybe a specific policy, but if probation is really trying to reduce recidivism, it ultimately comes down to long-term behavior change and individualized needs around that. And some of that is part of the probation officer, again, kind of figuring out how to work with that person. Often we hear that, when you see different kind of sanctions stack up or different violations stack up, that, then the revocation hearing comes, and there's sort of a tipping point in which sometimes officers feel like they just can't work with that person anymore. They've tried everything that they can and they don't know what else to do. But that's an area of discretion that, that maybe some cases there is that they have tried everything and it is the last resort, but trying to utilize other behavior change strategies first, so that ultimately, if it comes to that point, it really is the last resort. And I think sometimes it's a bit tricky because you feel like you've tried other things and you're not seeing immediate change, but change is incremental and it happens over time. And a lot of people, you have to kind of celebrate the small wins. You might have to do more interventions. And so it's kind of a tricky balance there. And so that's why I say I don't maybe have the specific policy change to address that, but really it's kind of a combination of these different approaches and learning how they kind of fit together for probation officers.
Thanks, Erin. To Erin's point, I'll also just add that we also have heard from various kind of probation agents, and when we've done various surveys, that sometimes probation agents get very fed up. They have, as Erin was sharing, that they've worked with this individual and they felt like they made a number of interventions and they're just like kind of done with this person, and so the next step is revocation. And I know one jurisdiction is looking at kind of addressing this issue with it's kind of more with the probation agent, where when somebody gets revoked in this jurisdiction, the person, once they come back from the revocation, goes back to that same probation agent, so that they can't just kind of wash their hands of this person, that they have to continue to work with them. So for better or for worse, maybe this is not the best person to work with them, so that may be something to consider. We had talked previously in the policy framework, and not in this section necessarily, but about sometimes it's helpful to have teams, two individuals, a supervision officer, and then kind of like a caseworker. They had this in Arizona for a certain level of supervision, so that maybe if the person on supervision doesn't jive well with one individual, they can work better with another. So it's another way to kind of like strategies to address some of these things.
Yeah, Connie, I was just going to say, I think that's an also a really good point. I think we do a pretty good job focusing on risk and needs and how to adjust supervision strategies to do that. But the thing we often leave out is responsivity. And so, sometimes too, it might be a matter of just figuring out, how best to assign people to their supervision officer. If it is just geography or maybe just even risk-based, some people just might not be matched well in terms of personality or building rapport, and those things matter too. And so I think that might just be another component to think about too.
And then other question that you asked, Commissioner Schultz, about the kind of limiting incarceration pending a revocation hearing. That policy focuses really on the kind of the use of summons as opposed to warrants, or if somebody is awaiting a hearing. So let's say that it's 15 days, or I think in some jurisdictions that I've seen it's up to 45 days, that and they still have not had a hearing. Is it the option is to release that person, especially if they're serving, they're awaiting a hearing and it's for non kind of criminal behavior or non-public safety threats. So that's one way to kind of reduce that time that somebody's spending incarcerated, just simply awaiting a hearing. Kelly, do you want to advance the slide? I pulled a little bit of data from. This is from CSG's Confined and Costly report. I heard that the agenda will include CSG this afternoon, so you may already see this, or you probably are already familiar with it. But this speaks specifically to their technical violation, or to you all technical violation and revocations for technicals and for non-technicals. So we said that 68% of prison admissions are for supervision violations. This is 2017, so the number's a little dated. I know that CSG is working on updating this with newer, more recent BJS numbers. And then this population makes up 33% of the prison population. So the below kind of very, no pretty graphs here, but just kind of straightforward information about broken down by admissions for probation and parole or post-incarceration supervision violations, and what is actually new offenses versus technical. And you can see here a lot of these numbers are definitely more technical that are leading to the admissions for the prison population. If you want to keep going, Kelly. And so finally, this last bucket discusses like really upfront investments. This speaks a little bit to, I think, the question that came up earlier about kind of where to invest money. I think that one of the things that we've heard from a lot of jurisdictions and talked to about in a lot of jurisdictions, really this idea of culture change. So, while it's the whole focus in many, or not the whole focus, but I think a big portion of the focus of probation and parole agents is to really work on behavior change. There also requires some level of culture change within an agency to be able to work with that individual. And so agencies need the kind of resources to be able to do that. And so the bucket here really talks about the use of financial incentives to promote success, training for staff, this idea of linking hiring and promotion with evidence-based practices, also adopting performance measures. One of the things that we found is that that there may be challenges to address disparate impact on supervision, but one of the issues is that data is often not collected, and that tracking demographic data related to outcomes is an attempt to really identify disparities and analyze the potential impact of policies and practices on different groups, especially with this current climate that we're in, where there is kind of like a resurgence of an anti-Black racist movement. This is one way to really kind of uncover what are some of the issues that may exist within an agency by tracking this data and trying to work on reducing and preventing any kind of racial and ethnic disparities that exist. And then the last two slides, if you want to just go through it, when we released this policy framework back in April, there were 11 kind of endorsements from national organizations who supported the policies in here. And then one came recently from the Americans for Tax Reform. And this last one is a number of 33 criminal justice professionals who endorsed the policy framework. So you probably know a lot of these folks on here, and they've kind of national voices on this topic. So if there's any other questions or thoughts people may have. Great. Okay, well, I'll turn it back over to Kelly and Aaron. Thank you all for letting me share.
Thank you.
All right, so I just wanted to do a sort of check here. We've thrown a ton of information at you already, and I want to make sure that we have a chance for you to ask any questions before we move on to talking about some of our on the ground projects. Anything else that you want to ask?